Okay, hello.
Yeah, okay. Mrs. Vassilakou, thank you very much for giving us this opportunity to interview you for the website Ethics of Care. You're one of the mayors of Vienna, the city of Vienna, and you're visiting the city of Utrecht in Holland with a delegation of people. Could you tell us a little bit about the aim, the purpose of this contact between cities, on cities that are healthy, that are that have a quality of life, cities that have an eye for the environment? Could you tell me a little bit about it?
Right. Well, cities are growing very fast all over the world, and I deeply believe that we should connect to each other. We have a lot to learn from each other because there are different topics where cities are specializing upon. We have been focusing, for instance, very highly on the issues of the qualities of public spaces and quality of living, let's say better quality of everyday life in Vienna. And at a conference a few months ago, I have seen a presentation from Utrecht, and I found out that they're focusing on exactly the same topics as well. So this is why we're here, to see precisely, to get a closer look on the strategies and also the implementation of the strategies within Utrecht, and find out what good practices and good ideas we can take back home.
Okay, thank you. And could you tell us a little bit more about quality of life, of everyday life, because that's, for us and for our viewers, is a very interesting concept. We concentrate also on everyday life and quality of life. So what is that? Does that mean to you, quality of everyday life?
Well, that's a good question. I think when politicians talk about quality of life, you always have to ask, and what do you mean by this precisely? Now, when I talk about quality of everyday life, I always think of children. I always think of a city that's good for children.
Okay, interesting.
Because what I say is a city that's good for children is good for everybody, and it's good for every generation. Why is that? Because if you think about what we all want for our children, we want them to grow up in a healthy and safe environment. We want them to be able to move around freely. We want them to be able to play. We want them to be able to enjoy outdoor life, to have contact to nature, to water also maybe. And these are qualities that young couples are searching for when they know that the first child is arriving. Most of them will tend to say, well, now we have to move out of the city to the countryside and buy a little house in the suburbs. Now, the little houses in the suburbs is maybe beautiful, but from the urbanist point of view, it's a disaster. Because, of course, it means all these people are driving their cars every day towards the city, having to drive the cars in order to access schools, in order to access working places, in order to access, let's say, supermarkets, for instance. And this leads to the huge problems of suburbanization. So, if you want to design a healthy, a livable city, then you have to provide these qualities within the heart of the city. Yes. Because this is the best way how you can keep young couples within the city. And yes, you can actually create a city that is beautiful, and people live there not because they have to, but because they want to.
Yes, yes.
Now, this clearly leads us to the qualities of public space. Because this means that you have to redesign city parts and city neighborhoods to places where people can move around freely and safely, where you realize that public space is there for everybody and not only for the cars, right? Where you realize that you need trees, you need possibilities to sit down and enjoy outdoor life. And this is clearly why we have all realized in the last years in cities all over the world that we have to redo public spaces and we have to regenerate our city centers.
Yeah. It's an interesting point of view. A city has quality of life when you look at the life of children. I immediately thought if it's suited for children, then it's suited for elderly people as well.
Right.
And there are many connections. I think if a child can play and there is enough green, then that city will be very interesting for elderly people as well. You've made a comment in your policy, and would like to ask you to give us some background on that. You've been saying, das Außen der Häuser ist das Innen der Stadt. So the outside of the houses where people live is the inside of the city.
Right.
I think it's a really fascinating formula, because we're talking about the interface between private life and public life. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, to be honest, this is a quote by Jane Jacobs, who has been extremely influential on my way of thinking and regarding, well, the city. Now, what I understand out of this quote is that if you ask yourself, where actually is the city? Where does it materialize? Where can you experience the city? Then you arrive at the conclusion that the city is not the inside of the buildings. It's the outside of the buildings. This is where we all have the possibility to meet each other, to inspire each other. This is where actually the city, in a sense, manifests itself. So you have to start realizing that public space is not whatever space is left when the buildings have been built. It is something you have to think of straight from the beginning. When you design new city parts, for instance, you have to do the design of public spaces first, and then place the buildings all over the scheme in a way that makes sense. And not do it the other way around as it was done in the 80s and the 90s. Right?
Public space as a leftover.
Right, as a leftover. And when you think of historical, of already, well, let's say already built city parts, then you have to take a closer look at the qualities of public spaces, and you have to rebuild them or regenerate them so that they can actually function as the inside of the city. So in a sense, you have to realize that the public space is the living room of the city. This is where we can enjoy life every day, as opposed to private spaces, let's say our own private living rooms, which is where we retreat actually from the city. And we actually always say we retreat towards our flats and our personal spaces. So yes, I think that politics should not only focus on the qualities of buildings, on affordable rents, which is also something very, very important if you're trying to build an inclusive city and if you're trying to keep young people within the city, right? Because this is also one reason why many young people will have to leave the city because they can't afford it anymore. So it's not only about affordability, it's not only about the architectural qualities of the buildings, you have to also focus on the inside of the city.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's another view on the interface of public and private spheres also, I think. Interesting. Another question. Vienna, as many of these growing cities in Europe, is getting more and more intercultural. I don't know whether the word intercultural is the proper wording, but people from all kinds of backgrounds come together. They are fleeing, they migrate, they try to find their new life in the city. So what is the connection between this idea of restructuring public space in connection to migration and the people from these very different cultures that actually do come together. I mean, you don't have to create that. They actually do come together, if you like it or not, so to say.
Well, this is maybe the main difference between multicultural and intercultural, right? And of course, we're aiming at creating an inclusive city, which would mean that it's not only about peaceful coexistence of different people from different parts of the world. It's also about communication. It's also about integration. It's also about developing a sense, a feeling that we belong together. We're all together part of the same society. And in the end, also developing new identities. Now, I think that the design of public spaces and green spaces can be crucial to this. And this is also something that cities all over the world are learning in the last years and can learn a lot from each other.
From each other, yeah.
Because, of course, clearly the way you design, for instance, a park can lead either to segregation,
yes,
not only of people from different cultural backgrounds, but also segregation of generations.
You see,
right?
I can see that immediately. Yes.
Or
Berlin is a very good example of segregation.
Right, right. And you can see it actually all over cities when you visit parks that were done mostly in the 90s and have not been regenerated ever since, where you have, these typical cages where children are supposed to play in there,
yes,
and different parts of the park for different types of people. And then, of course, you can have inclusive design, which will actually foster communication and mixed uses all on the same space, because this is how people come to interact, to get to talk to each other, to get to know each other, and maybe even start planning activities together.
Okay.
So there is a good example of this in Vienna when we redid the Maria-Hilfer-Straße, which used to be a road with heavy traffic, car traffic. At the same time, it is the longest shopping street of Central Europe. And we took the decision a few years ago to change it, to turn it into a pedestrian zone, the central part of it, and then there's also two parts of it that are shared space. So on a length of altogether 1.5 kilometers. Now, what we did was to design it in a participatory way, to invite all people that wanted to be part of it, to let us know what their needs are and what is the way that they would like to use the street, and to then invite architects from all over Europe to propose a design. It was actually won by a Dutch architects group, and it was redone in a wonderful way. And if you take a walk there on a sunny afternoon right now, you can actually see how different groups of people will share the street in the best sense of the word. Excuse me.
Thank you. One more last question. Within the ethics of care, the idea of circles of care and communities of care is very important. That's to say, people that are aware of each other's vulnerabilities, and people that gradually take up responsibility and care for each other. So not just, let me say, have a conversation that makes fun, which is good, but also really take care of each other when the occasion occurs. Would you comment on that idea of these caring communities? What could be the relevance for city policy?
Right. I think that this is one of the most important topics for growing cities and for the next decades. Because we have experienced, the last 2 decades would you say it in English, individualization?
Individualization, yes.
Yes. And actually, more and more people adopting a point of view that says, what do I care? And I think that this is disastrous for society. And it gets even more disastrous if you start thinking about millions of people having to share very little space, which is actually what is happening right now in cities all over the world. So it is our task to enable people to interact with each other, to get to know each other, to enable neighborhoods, to build a local society, and to develop activities that bring them together and let them develop a sense not only of belonging together, but also, once again, developing a common identity, even as a neighborhood. And this is where I think that urban design meets also modern and new tools of developing participation within the city. Maybe it's actually right now all about saying goodbye to the participatory tools of the 90s and, well, the first decade of this century, where we would tend to develop a plan on behalf of the city and then, let's say, let citizens talk about it, and in the end maybe try to develop something which we all share, and to move towards a direction where we invite people to talk straight from the beginning, and we can co-create the plan all together. Not only because then the plan is a more robust plan, and I deeply believe it's a better plan than if it was done only in a technocratic way, but also because the process of co-creation brings people together. And when I take a closer look at public spaces, I think that a central aspect is the usability, not only the accessibility, but also the usability of public spaces. So administrations tend, in earlier days, to have many, many rules and to be very strict about different uses that were not allowed. And I think we have to go the totally opposite direction. It's all about allowing for people to sit down on the lawns and have a picnic in the heart of the city. It's all about allowing for children to play ball on the street, of course, which is designed in a proper way. It's all about sharing space and allowing, for instance, also for, let's say, bikes to cycle in a, of course, at a low pace through a pedestrian zone. It's all about realizing that public space is where we can develop common activities. It's also about, for instance, allowing for neighborhood initiatives to do urban farming in public space, just to give you another example. Yeah. So all these kinds of activities can be encouraged, can be organized, can be a little bit financed by the city. And in some cases you don't have to do any of this, you just have to let them happen. And then you suddenly find out that you don't only have a lively city, a city that is thriving in terms of economic prosperity, but you also have a city where people belong together. And yes, I think this is the direction we have to work at.
It's interesting for the ethics of care, the emphasis that you put on belonging, and people getting to that point, to that stage where they can recapture that idea of belonging together.
Yes, maybe one last issue, because I think one barrier in our thinking that we have to overcome is the idea that here is me and my family and my friends, and over there are the strangers. People will tend to care for their own people and will not care for strangers. If you design, if you create a city where people around you are not experienced as strangers, where you experience yourself as part of a lively society, and all other people around you are also part of something where you all together belong to, then I think this is the way how you can get people to care about others, but also to care about society.
Ms. Vassilakou, thank you very much for the interview. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.